Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here this afternoon to learn a little bit about LGBTQ inclusion in the workplace today with us. My name is Sanjeeta Pradhan. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Greater Des Moines Partnership. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm really excited to have all of you today. I know you probably had a lot of other priorities and things to be at and things to do. And we're really thankful for all of you to spend this next hour and a half with us. I would like to introduce our first speaker, I would say our main keynote speaker for today. Max Mowitz is Program Director at One Iowa. Iowa's statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization overseeing organizational programming, direct services, and community education via LGBTQ training. Max has been active in LGBTQ advocacy work since coming out in high school, focusing on comprehensive LGBTQ education to the broader community as a component of queer liberation. Max specializes in topics related to trans and non-binary community, LGBTQ birth work, LGBTQ inclusive healthcare, and mental health care as a certified community health worker. Max previously served as the volunteer and office coordinator at the Young Women's Resource Center after earning their undergraduate degree in ethnomusicology and African American studies. Max has volunteered as a sexual assault and domestic violence survivor and victim advocate in both Illinois and Iowa, and is part of the Planned Parenthood Speakers Bureau. Max is pursuing their birth and postpartum doula certification and is practicing as a gender-affirming doula, serving trans and non-binary individuals in their gender-affirming experiences as a support system as they navigate healthcare systems, social gender affirmation, and mental health. I'm really excited for Max to be with us today. Every time I have heard Max, I have learned something new. So Max, thank you for being here, and I've given you screen share access and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you all for having me today. I'm Max Mowitz. My pronouns are they and he. And I was really excited to see with the poll questions, kind of where you're all at. I would be just interested, just curious if as we start this presentation, you all don't mind, the folks that put yourself as a 9 for having an inclusive work environment. I would love to know what that looks like for y'all, because everybody kind of has different systems for how they think their workplace is doing. So if you have some things things that your workplace has done to move forward in LGBTQ inclusion, please pop those in the chat. I would love to learn more and see what that looks like for everyone, because every different work environment is going to be totally different, right? So what we're going to do today, we obviously have an incredible, lineup of speakers for today after me, but I wanted to set the foundation. There were folks, when it came to what y'all's knowledge was, a lot of folks in that 5, 6, and 7 range, right? That maybe, you don't know as much as you'd like to, but you feel pretty okay. The thing is that even if you are a 1 or a 10 on that scale, we're actually going to all meet in the middle today. And I'm going to try not to assume any knowledge here, and we're going to start from the basics up. That way we all, get on the same page and feel comfortable with the material and the different things that we're learning so that we can build those inclusive work environments. So we're going to dive right in. Of course, in my work and our work at One Iowa, we start all of our events, all of our presentations with a land declaration. A land declaration is the acknowledgement of the stolen Native and Indigenous lands that we are on. So here, if you are in the Des Moines metro area, you are probably on the stolen Native and Indigenous lands of the Iowa, the Meskwaki, the Lakota, and Dakota tribes. So my recommendation is, if you are not familiar with what stolen land you are on, that you do some research. It's actually really easy. You can just quickly Google it. But the reason we start with the land declaration is obviously it's an important acknowledgement in and of itself, but also because it's really, really important to understand that Native and Indigenous liberation is tied up in LGBTQ liberation, right? So when we're celebrating Pride Month, we need to be upholding, uplifting, and honoring LGBTQ people for all of their identities, not just for being LGBTQ. And so that's something that I hope you kind of take with you as we talk through some of these big ideas today. Really quickly, here at One Iowa, we've been around since 2005. We started as a marriage equality organization in 2005. And the idea was that if we could get marriage equality in the state of Iowa, we could get it in other parts of the nation. Of course, as of April 3rd, 2009, we've had marriage equality here in the state because of a ruling by the Iowa Supreme Court. So we've been focusing on a lot of different areas since then. The three main areas we focus on is workplace culture, which is what I'm going to talk a lot about today. So if you want to do more workplace culture work, if you're one of those orgs that maybe is like a 5 or a 6 in terms of inclusivity and you want to get up to like 9 or 10, we can work with you on that. We also do healthcare access work. That's my personal kind of area of expertise is healthcare access, specifically for trans and non-binary people. But as an organization, we work in that area as well, and doing different like public health campaigns as well. So that's something we focus on, and also leadership development. So every year we have an LGBTQ Leadership Institute. It's a 4-month-long program that is aimed at empowering and cultivating leaders in different Iowa communities. So it's not just for people in the city of Des Moines, which is really exciting. So we stay pretty busy. If you are a person that's very interested in what's happening in the Iowa legislature, what's happening at the Capitol, I highly recommend you get connected with One Iowa Action. That's our policy and advocacy sibling organization. One Iowa Action is a great thing to be plugged into if you want to know about the state of LGBTQ rights. You might have heard that there were 15 anti-LGBTQ bills that were introduced to the Iowa legislature this legislative session. That's a problem, right? And we need folks like y'all to be engaged in that work, because when things like that happen, it impacts LGBTQ people all across the state of Iowa. I wanted to just really quickly set the stage. So these are non-negotiable group agreements for us at One Iowa. The first one is the Vegas rule, the confidentiality rule. So what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in this training stays here. Of course, one thing to keep in mind is that this is being recorded, right? So it's not like a perfectly confidential space. We're not all in the same room together with a closed door, right? But we can still take that kind of value of confidentiality with us. And what I mean by this is, if you learn something incredible about trans people from me, share that widely. Like, that doesn't need to be kept confidential. But if a person that's on this call shares something very personal about their like trans cousin, for example, we want to keep that story here in this space as much as we're able to. That being said, I want to remind you that there's no such thing as a silly question. In 2020, I was able to train over 2,000 people. It was an amazing experience, but it also means that I have been asked every question under the sun. In fact, I love getting questions I've never heard before. So please feel free to ask a question. It's not very often that you have this opportunity to ask an LGBTQ person and advocate any question that you may have. Also keep in mind that this is one of the only spaces where that's the case. You probably shouldn't ask a lot of the LGBTQ people in your life, questions about the LGBTQ community, as that can be in many ways a microaggression, right? So we want to keep that in mind, that these are cool opportunities to ask the questions that you've had. And also remember that if you have the question, probably like 4 other people on the call have the question. So we want to make sure that we're asking those challenging questions. Another thing that's really cool about us being on Zoom is you can actually direct message me a question. So if you don't want other people to know that you asked a question, you can always just direct message me, and I won't say who asked it, but I can shout out the question and answer it. So please feel free to do that. And actually, that's my recommendation moving forward. Please pop questions either directly to me or to the general chat. Please pop those into the chat. I recommend not trying to unmute yourself and ask a question, because I talk a mile a minute. I'm already talking really fast, and I kind of have a flow for how I like to present. So I will see your question. I'm great at watching the chat while I am presenting, and I will answer the question as soon as I get a chance to and an opportunity to. So just keep that in mind. Pop those things in the chat. I would love to hear from you. And then, of course, finally, we want to assume positive intent of everyone here. I know we're all here to learn and grow together, but we can also honor impact if something harmful comes up in the course of the training. Awesome. So just a grounding slide here for you all. I know, especially when we talk about LGBTQ folks, diversity, inclusion, and equity work, some folks get really, really overwhelmed, right? And I want to remind you that we at One Iowa are a resource here for you. And I would just hate it if you walked away from this training feeling like you had to ace a quiz on the LGBTQ community. That's not the goal here. We're actually going to talk about some habits that you can build to become more LGBTQ inclusive in your everyday life. These are habits that you can expand in all different areas of your life, including your work environment, right? So it's more important to understand some of the skills that I'm going to shout out than it is to know every single identity perfectly, right? Because ultimately it's the ways that we act towards LGBTQ people that make the most lasting impact, and not maybe baseline knowledge. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to be an expert to get some of these basic tools together. And that's really all we're going to do today, is talk about that basic information. And as long as you're willing to keep learning, that's good news, right? So I'm going to start at the very beginning, because some of y'all, you said maybe you were a 1 to 5 on that, how well do you understand LGBTQ inclusivity? Again, for some of you, you might be like, I was a 10. I know all of this already. That's totally okay. We're going to try to meet in the middle here today. So take what you need, leave what you don't, right? So let's start with the LGBTQ acronym, right? I've already said it like 50 times. It's Pride Month. It's really important to know exactly what it means. So let's start with these letters that are blocked out in blue here, the L, the G, and the B. The L stands for lesbian. A lesbian is typically a woman that is sexually and or romantically attracted to other women. G stands for gay. A gay person is typically a man that is sexually and or romantically attracted to other men, although gay is often used as an umbrella term. So if you're familiar with, say, Ellen DeGeneres, she identifies both as a lesbian and as a gay woman, so that's totally fine. And the B stands for bisexual. And a bisexual person is a person that is sexually and or romantically attracted to people of 2 or more genders. So that's where we get the bi and bisexual, is for those 2 or more genders that people are attracted to. So these 3 terms are blocked out in blue because they're all sexual orientations. And you know that I'm describing a sexual orientation because I'll say X is sexually and or romantically attracted to Y. And that's because sexual orientation is the persistent pattern of sexual and or romantic attraction, right? Pretty simple. But sexual orientation is actually pretty different from gender identity, which is what the T is. So the T stands for trans or transgender. And a trans or transgender person is a person that doesn't identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So a gender identity, which is blocked out here in orange, is the persistent and internal sense of one's own gender. Another good thing to keep in mind with this is that sometimes when I talk to people about the LGBTQ community, they'll say stuff like, oh, well, you're automatically gay if you're trans. That's not the case, right? Sexual orientation and gender identity, they're describing 2 really different things, right? So you can't know someone's sexual orientation by knowing that they're trans. And so that's something to keep in mind. A really good thing that popped up in the chat is why shouldn't we say transgendered? Transgendered, or using ED at the end of transgender or intersex, it's just not best practice, right? It's just kind of outdated language. So there's no reason to ever put an ED at the end of transgendered, because you can't become transgendered. Like being transgender doesn't happen to you, so you can't be transgendered, if that makes any sense. So that's why we avoid using that kind of language. All you have to do is say transgender or intersex, and there's no reason to ever put an ED on the end of those 2 words in any scenario. Very, very good question. Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking that question. I really appreciate it. Another really good way, if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed by the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, a really good and easy way to remember it is that sexual orientation is who you go on a date with, and gender identity is who you go on a date as. That brings me to the Q. Q stands for both queer and questioning. A person that's questioning is a person that's figuring out their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or both at the same time. So that's why the Q here, as you can see, points to both sexual orientation and gender identity, because it can describe both. The word queer is a word that we want to pay attention to as well. A queer person is a person that's part of the broader LGBTQ community. There are as many ways to be queer as there are queer people, which is why so many people really love the term queer. They love it because it's not terribly prescriptive. You can be so many different there are so many different ways to be queer, right? The thing we want to be careful with the word queer is that it is a reclaimed term. So a reclaimed term is a term that's been used against a community as a negative thing or a slur that has since been reclaimed by that community as a positive word. That being said, the LGBTQ community is not a monolith. So some LGBTQ people do not like the word queer, and some love the word queer, and some don't feel any feelings about the word queer, right? And this brings me to one of my first skills that I recommend you build. And that's to, instead of trying to have all these terms memorized or figure out if someone's queer or something like that, instead, I want you to listen to the way that a person talks about themselves and mirror that language back to them. That's the most powerful thing. So let's say you're talking to Mary as an example, and Mary says, "Hey, I'm Mary, I identify as a lesbian." What you shouldn't do is then refer to Mary as a queer woman, because you don't know what her relationship with the word queer is. She might not like it, she might not feel affirmed by it. And so rather, you want to listen to the way she talked about herself, right? And so she referred to herself as a lesbian, so you can refer to her as a lesbian. Now, in the course of everyday conversation, is it going to come up that Mary is a lesbian? Probably not. But it's very, very helpful if you are a person that works in any kind of like helping field, social work, or a medical field, because you really want to listen to the way that your client or patient is talking to you and mirror that language back to them. So just something to keep in mind, as you move forward working with the LGBTQ community. So another thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, sexual orientations, that pattern of sexual and romantic attraction. Most people are familiar with straight. A straight person is a person that is sexually and or romantically attracted to a gender different from their own. And then I want to go back down and talk a little bit about the difference between bisexual and pansexual. So like I said before, a bisexual person is a person that is sexually and or romantically attracted to somebody of, or people of two or more genders. Whereas a pansexual person is a person that is attracted to somebody regardless of gender. So another way of thinking about this, it's the most minute difference, right? Another way of thinking about this is that if we were to have a bisexual person and a pansexual person fill out a dating profile, the bisexual person would say, for example, I'm attracted to men and women. Whereas the pansexual person might say, I'm attracted to people that love to kayak, or people that value honesty, or people that value social justice, for example, right? So it has a lot more to do with the character and the personality of the person. So it's a very, very slight difference. That being said, the cool, incredible, and just amazing thing about the LGBTQ community is that we have so many unique ways about talking about our own sexual orientations and gender identities. That being said, bisexual and pansexual gets used interchangeably all of the time, which is why, again, it's less important to have all these terms memorized and more important to listen to the way a person talks about themselves, right? Because one person might really prefer the term bisexual, one might really like the term pansexual. We just want to use the language that feels good to them, right? That's going to be the most important part. And that brings me to asexuality. So an asexual person is a person that doesn't experience sexual and or romantic attraction to other people. Now, all of these sexual orientations exist on a spectrum. One thing to keep in mind with asexuality is that it's different from celibacy. Celibacy is the choice or intention to not engage sexually or romantically with other people, whereas asexuality, just like all sexual orientations, is not a choice. And that's because it's determined by a lot of factors at a very young age. So you can't change it through therapy because it's not a mental illness or an emotional problem. The other thing to keep in mind is that sexual orientation is not always lined up with sexual behavior. I think often of our LGBTQ elders when I think about this. So think about a gay man that's coming out in his 60s, maybe he's 65, and he's coming out for the first time in his life because it's never been safe for him to be out. A beautiful, incredible thing, right? His sexual orientation is that he's a gay man, but let's say, for example, he's had a family with a woman, right? That would mean that his sexual behavior is different than his sexual orientation. Does that make him any less of a gay man? No. It's just important to recognize that sexual orientation does not always dictate sexual behavior and vice versa. That brings me to the difference between sex and gender. I love talking about this stuff. It's so much fun. Sex is just a biological classification. It's just what's happening in the body, right? So it's hormones, chromosomes, internal and external reproductive anatomy. So if sex is what's happening in the body, gender is what's happening all around us. So gender is really highly influenced by society. Like I said, it's kind of like the swimming pool that we're all swimming in, right? And it is made up of a variety of traits that are social, psychological, and emotional. In the United States in 2021, the way that we understand gender most in the most mainstream way is through the gender binary. The gender binary is the idea that is just men and women, right? A binary is made up of two choices, zeros and ones, men and women in this situation. Most people understand gender in that way. If I were to ask people what are the genders, they would say men and women, probably most proportionally. So that's something to keep in mind, because as the gender binary, does not serve all people, it is something to really have a good understanding of, because it helps us understand the things that face trans and non-binary people as we talk about those folks in a little bit. But the thing to keep in mind is that sex and gender, they don't line up, right? They're not always the same for any given person. So we want to really divorce these concepts from each other, right? One thing that I frequently think about when it comes to sex and gender is gender reveal parties. So typically in a gender reveal party, a person finds out the sex characteristics of their baby, and as a result then has a gender reveal party. And we'll talk more about those in a little bit, but the fact of it is that you can't know the gender of a person until they tell you, right? And at that stage, there's no way to know a gender of a baby. We only know their sex characteristics. So it's really good to try to get out of the habit of assuming that we know someone's gender based on their sex characteristics and vice versa. And we'll talk more about how that relates to the trans and non-binary community in a moment. So gender identity is something that we all have. Like I said before, it's that persistent and internal sense of your own gender. For a lot of people, their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth do match up. So I live really, really close to Blank Children's Hospital. Let's take a baby that's born there this afternoon. The doctor takes a look at the baby and based on its sex characteristics, assigns it female at birth. If that baby then grows up to identify as, say, a woman, then that woman is a cisgender woman, which means she identifies with the same gender that lines up with the sex that she was assigned at birth. The majority of people are cisgender. If that same baby assigned female at birth grows up to identify as, say, a man, then that man is a transgender man, which means that he does not identify with the gender that lines up with his sex assigned at birth. That's the main difference between transgender and cisgender. So it's really important to keep in mind with gender identity that we can't know someone's gender identity until they tell us. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this might seem really basic, but the only prerequisite for identifying as your gender identity is to identify as your gender identity. By that I mean, the only prerequisite for identifying as, say, a woman is to identify as a woman. You don't need to act, talk, think, or dress a certain way, or have certain sex characteristics to be a woman. We'll talk more about that. I'm sure for right now, you're like, well, duh, Max, I know that. But when we talk about trans and non-binary people, that's where the rubber meets the road of that concept. So hold on to that for a moment. This is a Venn diagram that shows the overlap between sex assigned at birth and gender identity. So if your sex assigned at birth overlaps with your gender identity, then you're a cisgender person. So one really quick thing that we'd like to talk about that's directly related to our land acknowledgement is the way the gender identity has been influenced by Western colonialism. So if you're not familiar, colonization, the description is up on the slide here, but we focus a lot on Western colonialism when we talk about gender identity in the United States. And the reason being is that here in North America, there were thousands of Native and Indigenous tribes that lived on this land before Western European colonizers came to this land. And each one of those tribes had a different, disparate way of understanding gender identity outside of a gender binary. So for some tribes, there was a gender binary. For some tribes, there were many genders. And it really depends. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush because there were so many robust, complex, beautiful ways to understand gender. When Western colonizers came to the United States, or at the time just North America, and took over land over the course of history. They intentionally eradicated these non-binary genders, these genders that existed outside of being men and women. There's a robust and rich history of this happening. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you get acquainted with this history. But when we talk about gender identity in the United States in 2021, we have to talk about this history, because a lot of people think that there's only men and women, that's what's natural. But really, when we look over the course of human history and when we look globally, we see that there are many, many beautiful gender identities that exist outside of the binary. And the reason that we believe in the gender binary as rigidly as we do has everything to do with our colonialist past. And that brings me to gender expression. Gender expression is a ton of fun. We all have a different relationship with it. So it's just personality traits, ways of dressing, our mannerisms that kind of communicate to other people our relationship to gender and gender roles. It can communicate to other people what that might look like. It might not, though. So think about it. How are you expressing your gender today? Like, reflect on yourself. Do you wear your hair long or short? Are you wearing perfume or cologne? Are you sitting with your legs crossed or uncrossed? These are all really, really good examples of gender expression. So the thing to keep in mind with gender expression is it has nothing to do with our biological sex. The way that you dress doesn't have anything to do with the levels of estrogen or testosterone in your body. It has everything to do with our geographic location and our time period, because gender expression is highly culturally sensitive. And if we think about it, we know that gender expression shifts and flows for a lot of different people in different ways. So I want you to imagine, if you will, two cisgender women standing in front of you. So again, a cisgender woman is a woman that was assigned female at birth and grew up to identify as a woman into adulthood. So a cisgender or two cisgender women standing in front of you. One has a shaved head, full face of makeup on, and she's wearing a dress and combat boots. And then the woman standing next to her has long hair, no makeup on, and is wearing a pantsuit and high heels. So one's got long hair, one's got a shaved head, one's wearing makeup, one isn't, etc., etc. So these are both women, but they're just expressing their gender really differently. Does that make them any less or more of women? Absolutely not. We know that. So let's follow the woman with the shaved head on her way to work tomorrow. So let's say she likes to go catch an early morning workout, and let's say it's, safe to go to the gym. So she gets up at 5 a.m. really, really early for her workout. So she doesn't put on any makeup because it's too dang early. And she decides to wear her favorite pair of baggy gray sweats because they keep her comfy at the gym. So she finishes up at the gym and she decides to stop by her favorite coffee shop for a drink on her way home. And when she walks into the coffee shop, the barista takes a look at her, sees that she's got a shaved head, no makeup on, and baggy gray sweats on, and says, "Oh, good morning, sir." So a couple of things have happened here. The first is this is what we refer to as misgendering. Misgendering is when we use the wrong gendered language to refer to a person, i.e. using sir to greet a woman. The second thing that's happened here is that this woman is no less of a woman because somebody called her sir, right? Just because somebody misinterpreted her based on her gender expression doesn't mean she's any less of a woman. Remember that the only prerequisite for identifying as a woman is to identify as a woman, right? You don't need to look a certain way. That's something to keep in mind. But the third piece of this, and this is one of those habits and skills that I wanted to shout out, is that this could have been avoided if the barista had simply not used gendered language and had not made an assumption about her based on how she looked. When we stop making assumptions about people's gender based on how they look, we are on the path to queer and LGBTQ liberation, right? Because it's always like so much of the violence and the harm that happens to LGBTQ people happens because of assumptions that are made, right? And so if the barista simply hadn't assumed what her gender was based on how she looked and just said, "Good morning, what can I get for you?" this wouldn't have happened. So when we're trying to move away from assuming people's gender neutral language and pronouns become very, very important and interesting tools to us to make sure that LGBTQ people and people at large feel safe with us, right? So we're going to talk about pronouns and gender neutral language in a little bit. And that's why it's so important, because if we move away from making assumptions, we have to have those tools in our tool belt. So I want to quickly just see if anybody happens to know who this person is as you're putting in your guesses or your answers. I'm just going to describe this picture. This is a child with, I like to call this like a bowl cut mullet because I think it like perfectly blends the two haircuts. They have on a light colored dress with bows and frills. They're wearing a hat with a bow and a feather in their hand, and they're wearing patent leather Mary Jane shoes. Now I think I'm seeing a couple of chats pop up. Cool. Yeah. So it sounds like one person thinks it's a previous president. Teddy Roosevelt's coming up. Looks like my grandfather. Yeah, so this is actually President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When he was 2 years, this picture was taken in 1884. And at the time, this was just how children under a certain age would dress for a formal occasion. Getting your picture taken would have been really expensive. So it would have been really important to like be wearing your quote unquote best. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you, this is a very important man in American history. However, if you were to see this child running through Casey's General Store on your way to work tomorrow morning, you might say, oh, little girl, where are your parents, right? So this is a really good example of how gender expression shifts and flows throughout the course of time. And we see this pan out in other ways. I mentioned earlier gender reveal parties. And gender reveal parties, typically, you cut into a cake and it's pink on the inside for girls. And if you shoot off confetti cannons, it's blue confetti for boys, right? But this shows that that's not always been the case. So this is an article from a trade publication that taught department stores how to set up their stores to sell more stuff, basically. And it said, the generally accepted rule is pink for the boys and blue for the girls. The reason is that pink, being a more decided and stronger color, is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl. So all of this is to say, I meet people all the time that are like, oh, LGBTQ people are fine, but I'd never put my son in pink. It's just not natural. There's nothing natural or unnatural about little girls wearing pink and little boys wearing blue. With that being said, I want to flag that there's nothing wrong. If you're a woman and you love pink and you're a man and you love blue, there's nothing wrong with that. At the end of the day, gender expression is supposed to make you feel awesome. It's supposed to make you feel good and affirmed in you, right? So that's something to keep in mind. It's so, so important to remember that. And we just don't want to make assumptions about other people based on how they're expressing their gender. So that brings me to the trans umbrella. For some of you, this is going to feel like a really basic slide. For others of you, you're going to be like, oh my goodness, what the heck is happening? So we're going to meet together. So a trans person, like I said before, is a person that doesn't identify with their sex assigned at birth, or is anyone that encompasses or crosses over and challenges society's expectations or standards surrounding gender. So very broad umbrella here. There are two main general ways of being transgender. You can be a binary transgender person or a non-binary transgender person. A binary transgender person is a person that fits into that gender binary we mentioned before, right? So trans women are women and trans men are men. Sometimes when people talk to me about trans folks, they'll be like, oh yeah, my cousin who's a trans woman, she used to be a man and now she's a woman. Your trans cousin has always been a woman. She's a woman, and that's how we should refer to her, right? So you could say my trans cousin is a woman, or just say my cousin is a woman, right? So there's never a reason to talk about somebody in their by their past gender or anything like that. This came up a lot when Elliot Page came out recently, who is the star of the movie Juno. I read headline after headline that said, Elliot Page, formerly known as XYZ Page. We want to try to avoid using language like that when we talk about transgender people. That brings me to non-binary transgender people. Non-binary transgender people are simply people that don't identify within the gender binary. So they don't identify as men or women. There are 6 such identities under this tiny umbrella, but there are frankly dozens of non-binary identities. In fact, there are as many ways to be non-binary as there are non-binary people. So there are, for example, agender people, which are people that don't have a strong gender identity. There's genderqueer and gender fluid people, whom are people whose gender identity and gender expression may shift and flow throughout the course of time. Two-spirit individuals are Native and Indigenous individuals, and depending on the tribe that they live in, their understanding of their gender identity, is going to be vastly different than a different tribe. Just a point here, you cannot be two-spirit unless you are Native and Indigenous. You cannot be a white person that's two-spirit, just to make that clear. I get a lot of questions about that. There's poly or bigender people, which are people who identify with multiple gender identities at once. And then there's demigender people, who are people that identify with a lot of the characteristics of a binary gender, but they don't identify as that gender itself. So a demi boy, for example, might identify with a lot of the characteristics of being a man, but they don't identify as a man itself. So a lot of information on this slide. I got a really good question that popped up that said, though I identify as a cis queer man, I often like to express my gender and sexuality by breaking the typical gender norms, i.e. wearing makeup and skirts, etc. I often avoid doing this within a professional environment to avoid discrimination and bias. I'm curious what advice you have for addressing this issue in your workplace. How do you suggest I push my workplace to be more inclusive while not maintaining my job safety and security? So this is a really good and challenging question, honestly. I would say that when it comes to, you know, a lot of LGBTQ people have to stay in the closet while they're pushing for this kind of stuff, or they can't be their full selves. This isn't ideal, right? We want to be our full selves, not only because it's the right thing to do as humans to like honor and uplift each other in the workplace, but also because it, you know, one thing that you can show your work environment, your company, is that when it comes to talent retention and acquisition, you know, honoring and uplifting your employees, making them feel supported and productive in their work environments, they need to feel included and they need to feel like they can be their full selves. And there are statistics after statistics about this. So it's really important to, you can always make the business case, but one thing you can always do is have us come in and help you, right? That's something that we do, is we try to get work environments kind of on board with creating more inclusive dress codes, for example. So the dress code isn't parsed out between being a man and a woman, right? Which means that anyone could wear a skirt, which is awesome. So there's a lot of little different things to do, but if you're unsure as to where to start, sometimes the business case is the best place, because people are always willing to talk numbers, even though that's not my favorite way of approaching things, it's definitely effective. But we're always happy to continue to be a resource, because that's really challenging and incredible work to be doing. So I'm so glad to hear that you're interested in taking that on. Another question that popped up is, it's very common for me to ask, do you have kids or are you married? What is a more inclusive way to ask questions like this? One thing you could just ask is like, what does your family look like? Or like, tell me more about like your partners if you have them. Do you have any partners? Things like that. And usually if you ask about like partners, you can learn a little bit more, because a partner could be a spouse, a partner could be a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or a non-binary partner, for example, that often like snowballs into a conversation about if somebody does have kiddos. So usually I just recommend just saying like, tell me a little bit more about your family. That can be a really good way to, you know, approach doing that. Another person asked, do you also help with making forms and applications more inclusive? We absolutely do. There are some things, we do what we call like a paperwork consultation, which means we can look over your employee handbooks, your applications, your intake forms, and take a look at all those different things and see what might be improved. So we can help with that, because I can give some broad recommendations, but every work environment is going to be a little bit different. So thank you for these phenomenal questions. It's always my favorite when I get a ton of questions. It makes me so, so happy. So I want to keep moving forward. Some things to keep in mind is that trans people can decide to transition at any age. They may or may not change their name or pronouns, and they may or may not use hormones or surgery. So we want to remember that a trans person is no more or less valid if they use hormones or surgery. Remember what I said before, the only prerequisite for identifying as a woman is to identify as a woman. You don't need certain surgeries or certain hormones in your body to be a woman, right? Trans women are women, whether or not not they use hormones and surgery. I can't emphasize that enough. That being said, when you meet a trans person, just ask what their name is and use that name. You'd be surprised how often we get questioned about our names. And then avoid invasive and unnecessary questioning. So this includes questions about hormones and surgeries. There is never a reason to ask a trans person about their use of hormones and surgery ever. The only exception to that rule is if you are their primary care physician, if you are like a person that is providing medical care to that person, and even then within the scope of your work, right? It might be very relevant to know if someone's using hormones or has had surgeries. The only other instance is if a trans person brings it up themselves. So you should never approach your trans friend and say, hey, have you started using hormones? Right? Because when you ask somebody if they've used hormones or surgery, what you're asking them in no uncertain terms is what their genitals look like, which is not something you would ask a cisgender person. So you should never ask a transgender person that same question. But if a trans person says, hey, I just started hormones, I'm really struggling, can we talk? That's a totally fine time to engage with that person about that. And then finally, before we move into some general recommendations, I want to talk about our intersex folks in our LGBTQ community. An intersex person is a person whose biological anatomy varies from the expected male or female hormones, chromosomes, internal and external reproductive anatomy. A lot of the time when we talk about biological sex, people think that there's only male or female. That's what's natural. I hear that all the time when we, kind of argue about LGBTQ people and intersex folks specifically. But we actually all exist on spectrums of maleness and femaleness because all of our different sex characteristics can shift, especially our hormones. So if you think about it, our hormones change quite a bit when we go through puberty, for example, or when we age, right? Or through the course of a menstrual cycle. So we're kind of moving along this different like spectrum of biological sex. This is an intentionally blurry image, so you're not supposed to necessarily be able to read it, but this is from Scientific American's Beyond XX and XY. It's a really good example of all of the different ways that a person might be intersex. Intersex folks make up between 0.5 and 1.5% of the population, which is similar to the percent of the population that has red hair. It's really important to learn more about intersex folks as they may or may not identify as LGBTQ, and they're often extremely underrepresented in our communities. And then finally, I wanted to obviously talk a little bit about the gender unicorn. This is from the Trans Student Educational Resources. This is a great thing to have at your desk when you're working. You can always Google the gender unicorn and it'll pop right up for you. This is a great way to think a little bit more about all the different terms and definitions we just talked about. But of course, remember, it's not always obvious who's LGBTQ, and it's never okay to ask invasive questions about people's bodies or transitions or to out them against their will. Confidentiality is really important when people come out to you as LGBTQ. And keep in mind that there are no universals. Some LGBTQ people don't even like that term. We're not a monolith, right? So it's really important, like I said before, to listen to the way a person talks about themselves and mirror that language right back to them. Okay, so a person asked a great question, which perfectly segues into the next kind of section of this presentation, which is, I find guys to be the hardest gendered language for me to shake because I use it like you all. What are some other options and what is some gendered language that we may not be aware of? We're actually going to talk about that in a moment, just so hang tight and we're going to get into it. Very good question though. So we've already talked about the two main ways to be inclusive, which is to mirror language and avoid making assumptions. Right now, we're going to talk about asking and giving pronouns, using and practicing gender neutral language, and preparing to apologize. And then I'm going to get in a little bit of time. You all have been asking great questions throughout, but give a little bit more time to answer questions. So a couple terms to know. We've already talked about misgendering. Misgendering is using the wrong language to refer to a person, i.e. using sir to greet a woman. Dead naming is when we use someone's legal or given name instead of their correct name post-transition. So, if you've known Sally for 20 years and Sally just came out as Sally and she goes by Sally now, even if you're talking about Sally, from a memoir or an anecdote from 15 years ago, you should always refer to Sally as Sally. And that's because dead naming and misgendering are things that add to dysphoria, which is the distressed state arising from a conflict between a person's gender identity and the sex that the person has or was identified as having at birth. We want to avoid misgendering and dead naming as much as possible. So how do we do that? Let's talk about pronouns. These are extremely powerful when we're talking about inclusive work environments. Pronouns are mandatory. They're not optional. They are literally the bare minimum, right? So please get used to asking and learning about pronouns because they are one of the fundamental ways to be LGBTQ inclusive. Pronouns are personhood. They show somebody that you see them as a person, right? And so when you don't use someone's correct pronouns, you're undercutting that pretty substantially. And finally, you don't need to understand someone's pronouns to use them. So you don't need to get it to use someone's pronouns. So a pronoun is a word that's used in a sentence to refer to a person without using their name. So June is a good example. June uses she and her pronouns. If I were to use that in a sentence, I would say June goes to the store to buy her groceries. She stops by the mall to pick up her favorite nail polish. That nail polish is now hers. So most people are comfortable and familiar with using she, her, or he, him pronouns. However, sometimes we want to use gender neutral pronouns, specifically singular they and them. Singular they and them has two main uses. It's practical and it's often a gender neutral pronoun. So you can use they, them pronouns when you don't know the pronouns of the person that you're talking about, if you don't know their gender. So let's say, you all have used this in your life. I know it, right? So let's say you're at a restaurant, you see a wallet on a table. You'd say, oh no, somebody left their wallet at their table. Somebody should turn it in for them. What you probably wouldn't say is, oh no, somebody left his or her wallet at his or her table. Somebody should turn it in for him or her, right? That's really clunky. It's very cumbersome, right? So we're actually used to using this all the time. The other time, like I said, that you'd want to use singular they and them is if that's someone's correct pronouns. So you heard me at the beginning of the presentation share my pronouns. One of my pronouns is they, them, theirs, right? So if you were to refer to me respectfully, you'd want to use they, them pronouns. Now, one thing that pops up a lot when I talk about they, them, and theirs pronouns is grammar. So they, them, theirs pronouns is grammatically correct. It's part of the Merriam-Webster and Oxford dictionaries. It's also part of the AP style guide, the APA citation guide, and it was part of Shakespeare's poetry. It's part of Jane Austen's literature. We've been using they, them, theirs pronouns as a singular pronoun for hundreds of years. If you are struggling with it, I'm actually going to give you an example of how you can practice pronouns in a little bit. But one thing to keep in mind, let's say you're working with a coworker who absolutely does not want to use they, them pronouns because it's, quote, grammatically incorrect. And they're digging their heels in and they absolutely refuse. My recommendation for a reframe in that situation, if you're working on trying to making a more inclusive environment, is to tell that person that even if it was grammatically incorrect, which it's not, but even if it was, somebody's personhood is always more important than grammar, period, right? Somebody's personhood is always more important than grammar. It really makes the grammar argument seem inconsequential. So let's talk more about they, them, theirs pronouns. So let's take Andy, for example. Andy uses they, them pronouns. If I were to use that in a sentence, I would say Andy goes to the store to buy their groceries. They stop by the mall to pick up their favorite nail polish. That nail polish is now theirs. But let's say you have a new team member on your team named Sid, and Sid uses Z-Zers pronouns. Now, Z-Zers pronouns is an example of a neopronoun. There are dozens of these pronouns, more than we could ever talk about in a single training. So I'm going to give you an example of how you can practice those in a little bit if you ever interact with pronouns you've never heard of before. So here's an example. Sid goes to the store to buy Zers groceries. Z stops by the mall to pick up Zers' favorite nail polish. That nail polish is now Zers. So another just really good example, right? One thing to keep in mind is if you work with a person with two sets of pronouns, like I use they and he, you can use those pronouns interchangeably. My recommendation would be to stick with the same pronoun within the course of one conversation. So, let's say, Andy uses they and he pronouns. What you'd want to say is Andy goes to the store to buy his groceries. He stops by the mall to pick up his favorite nail polish. That nail polish is now his. Or Andy goes to the store to buy their groceries, etc., etc. What you wouldn't want to say is Andy goes to the store to buy their groceries. He stops by the mall to pick up their favorite nail polish. That nail polish is now his, because that gets kind of confusing. So just choose one for the course of a conversation, but there's no correct pronoun if somebody has two or three sets of pronouns. So where should you share your pronouns? Email signatures, name tags, business cards, email introductions. So if I'm looping someone in on an email, I'll include their pronouns in parentheses next to their name. And then this one's really powerful. First interactions and introductions, so vital. Just say, hey, my name is Max. My pronouns are they and he. What's your name and pronouns? Keep it super casual. It doesn't have to be a big deal. And then you can also include it in your Zoom title, WebEx title, Teams title, whatever works for you. You can update that. So I want to talk about gender neutral language. We already got a great question about it. So when it comes to addressing groups of people, you can say folks, everyone, y'all, or you all, that works too, instead of ladies or guys. I also recommend instead of ladies and gentlemen, you could say honored guests. Instead of saying, I hear this all the time, oh yeah, the mailman stopped by today. Chances are really good that you have not talked to your post person about their gender. If you have, that's very cool. But if you haven't, you want to refer to them as the mail person or the post person or the service person or congressperson, right? Those are useful for you to know. Then there's parent, caregiver, and trusted guardian, because not all families have two parents. Not all families have parents, period. And not all parents identify as mom or dad. There's sibling instead of son or sister or brother, child instead of son or daughter, partner, significant other or spouse instead of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, or wife. And then we also recommend that you use correct anatomical terminology when you're talking about body parts. So a good example of this is feminine hygiene products or women's like nursing rooms, right? People of all genders nurse, and people of all genders menstruate. So we want to talk specifically about what we're talking about. If we're talking about a nursing room, call it a nursing room. If we're talking about menstrual pads, call them menstrual pads, not feminine hygiene products, right? So be specific. I want to slow down really quickly to answer any questions that have popped up. Awesome. Will you talk about how to explain to someone why pronouns are important? Like in attending a meeting, we were asked to give our pronouns and someone asked why that's a big deal and acted like it was ridiculous because we don't identify as other categories we fall into. Yeah. Somebody also mentioned pals. Pals is great. Pals, friends, really awesome. So yeah, one thing I recommend is when you're coming up against a disagreement about if you should share pronouns in like a professional setting, my recommendation would be like, hey, even though, you know, for a lot of us, we don't have to think twice about our pronouns, it's really, really great to normalize asking about pronouns so that we create more safe and inclusive environments. And you can say the best practice in creating an LGBTQ inclusive work environment is to introduce yourself with name and pronouns, include name and pronouns in your signatures and your name tags and your business cards, because that's a good way to not only normalize talking about pronouns, but it's also a good way to make our LGBTQ staff members feel included. And you can always say, we want to create an inclusive work environment, right? And if the person agrees, then your work is done. If the person doesn't agree, that's a larger conversation to have. But that's always my recommendation, is to kind of reframe it from the perspective of trying to create an inclusive work environment. And also clients and customers, really, really good point. So I wanted to give you a skill that you can learn. So if you're trying to practice gender neutral language, Z0's pronouns, another neo pronoun that you hear, they, them, theirs pronouns, here's a way to practice. I want you to go home tonight, take a random book off of a random bookshelf, open it to a random page and choose a random paragraph. And I want you to make every single gendered piece of language in that paragraph gender neutral. So I'll show you an example. Max wants to go to dog park with his dog, Andy, because she loves to play with other dogs. Let's say I want to practice they, them, theirs pronouns. I'd say Max wants to go to dog park with their dog, Andy, because they love to play with other dogs. Let's say I want to practice Z0's pronouns. I could say Max wants to go to dog park with Z's dog, Andy, because Z loves to play with other dogs. Or let's say I want to practice gender neutral language. For the third sentence, I'd say Dylan decides to bring their sibling, Sid. Right? So this is a really good way to, in a safe space, practice using gender neutral language so that you build that habit and you build that strength without making it an issue for the LGBTQ people in your life. So this is a really good trick to have up your sleeve, especially if you find yourself getting rusty on certain pronouns. And then finally, before I wrap up my time here, I want to show the art of the apology. This is really important because we're all going to goof up. I make mistakes all the time. So I believe that a great apology should take less than 10 seconds. It should be sincere and authentic. You want to affirm the pronoun or the gender or the name that you messed up on. You want to keep it concise, and you want to move on when you've apologized. And my bonus fifth thing would be to tell the person how you're going to be better. You don't want to over apologize, dwell on the mistake, explain why you made the mistake, or dwell on what happened, right? So a good example of this, let's say I misgender my boss, Courtney. Courtney uses she, her pronouns. Let's say I accidentally use he, him pronouns for her. What I would say is, oh my goodness, Courtney, I just realized I used the wrong pronouns for you. I'm going to make sure that in the future, I don't make that mistake again. I apologize, and move on. That's a perfect apology, right? So always make sure that you apologize when you make a mistake, even if it's far after the fact and you realized it later on. But make sure that your apology focuses on taking accountability for harm, and it doesn't focus on making you feel less bad, because that's not the point. The point is to take accountability. So with that being said, you all have asked phenomenal questions. I have just about 2 minutes here to maybe answer some rapid fire questions that might have popped up, but I want to make sure to be respectful of other folks' time, because there's more presentation to enjoy. So I'm happy to answer any questions as they've popped up. Now, I'm not seeing any in my chat.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I don't see any additional questions either.
Awesome.
So, yeah, thank you again. Like I said, I learn a lot and something new every time I'm with you and hearing you. For folks who are still around, we have two other phenomenal speakers today, but the session is being recorded, and we will be able to share this with you after it's over, and when it's available, we'll let you know in an email. But I don't know if there are any other final questions that you want to pop in the chat. Thank you again for your Max. I would like all of you to give Max a virtual round of applause for amazing presentation and time. I'm going to take just a second to remove the spotlight here and transition to our next part of our event. So I am now, oh, Max, there was a question around whether the copy of the slides are going to be available. What's your preference? I know I'm very protective of my slides when I'm presenting.
Yeah,
what's your preference?
Unfortunately, One Iowa as an organization, we don't release our slides, unfortunately, but I'm always happy to keep having conversations. Feel free. I just popped my email address into the chat box, so feel free to reach out to me if you need any clarification. We also have a cute little LGBTQ 101 cheat sheet. If you want that, we can give that out freely. So thank you so much for asking. That's a good question.
Thank you, and appreciate it. A lot of organizations and presenters and people have put in a lot of their time and effort, and so I hope you can respect that. But they're a great resource. Please feel free to reach out to them, to invite them to your own space, to your employees. And so thank you again, Max. With that, we're going to transition into our next part of our conversation, and really wanting to bring a real life story and highlight an employer who is practicing and doing amazing work around LGBTQ inclusion. What does that look like, right? And so before I go into that, I just want to thank some of the people who have been really involved in bringing this to us so far. I want to thank our Inclusion Council member and chair of our Untapped Talent Subcommittee, Amanda Banks, who is on the call, Amber Ramirez, Tiffany Menke, Michelle Kraft, Joy Esposito, and Stephanie Wilkerson from our team from the Inclusion Council, and Quincy Bland, who is also in our council, but also really wanted to be the first one to say, we want to do something. We want to host this event, and been working behind the scenes for a really long time to bring this together for us today. So without further ado, I am going to give the floor to two amazing speakers from Unity Point Health, who is going to share with us some of the best practices that they have at Unity Point Health. And I have given you screen share access, Joyce and Dr. Noblock. Welcome to the conversation. I think, Joyce, are you going to start off today with us?
Actually, Angie, if you're ready, I will let you go first.
Awesome. Thank you.
And actually, I think Matt Swanstrom was going to jump on and talk a little bit about operational sort of logistics, because that was kind of in his realm. So he's going to, I think, speak, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
All right. Yeah. So we're kind of tossing things around here, but thank you for allowing us to join. My name is Matt Swanstrom. I'm a director of operations for Unity Point Clinic. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Just going to kind of give a little bit of a background, and I will be sharing some slides here in a moment. But kind of on our journey as far as Unity Point Clinic and providing services to the LGBTQ community. Late in 2017, early 2018, Dr. Patricia Newland, who is our Vice President Medical Director, approached me as a new director with the idea of looking into the LGBTQ clinic and how could we provide these services here in Central Iowa. We already had an established clinic in the Cedar Falls Waterloo market. Dr. Kyle Christensen, you may have heard his name, has been very instrumental in LGBTQ work, not only across the state, but also across the nation. We decided that we wanted to move forward with this. Our first goal was to provide a safe, inclusive environment for the LGBTQ community. Thinking and me coming into this, not knowing what that really meant, I'm into opening clinics and running clinics and, working with our operations team and our providers. There's a lot that goes into this. We went through a lot of different things. We started, like I said, late 2017, early 2018. We reached out to staff who would be interested in working in this clinic. The response was overwhelming. The number of people who wanted to be involved really shocked me. And we actually had an application process, and people told us the reason they wanted to be included in this great venture. We then had a great group of providers. We started with 7. We're currently at 7, who also said, we want to be a part of this clinic. So we started down that road. We knew one of the biggest things on the background, we've got electronic health records we need to take care of, setting up the clinic, different things like that. But first and foremost, it was safe zone training, and that truly was what it was all about. Max and their team did an amazing job for us. We set that up. We had a 4-hour in-person training one evening. The people were engaged. Max and their team they were amazing. Different stories, the education they provided. So we really started down that road to get the team who wanted to be there. So we opened up the clinic in May of 2019. I was fortunate enough to be there that night. I've been in many clinics, internal medicine, specialty, and so forth. The atmosphere of this clinic was amazing. Those employees wanted to be there. Those providers wanted to be there. They had already all worked 8 to 10-hour days. Our clinic meets the second Tuesday of each month from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. But they were truly, truly engaged. When I was there, I witnessed something I've witnessed before, but kind of in a different aspect. I saw tears. They weren't tears of someone getting a bad diagnosis. They were absolute tears of joy. I saw parents bringing in their adolescents. I saw young adults, older adults come to a safe place. And that's truly what we wanted to provide. Since then, we've continued to grow. We've expanded a little bit. We have trained many other Unity Point Clinic and Unity Point Health Des Moines employees. Dr. Noblock has done some presentations. Max was able to join us virtually a couple months ago for another large safe zone training. And we just continue to grow. We want to continue to grow and be able to serve this community. We have to do things a little bit differently in the clinic, and that's all right. That's what we need to do. We truly want to provide a safe environment. So that's kind of the operational background of where we're at. I'm going to try to share my screen here to make sure. I usually do this on Teams and not on Zoom, so I think hopefully all of you can see that. This is just a little bit about the clinic, what our focus is and what we truly need to do and truly want to do for the community. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Angie Noblack. She has been so instrumental in all of this work. She gives up her time. She never says no. That's why I can't ask her to do things all the time because she always says yes, and then I get her too busy. But she is going to speak to our clinic and from the physician side of it, and some of the different things that she feels are important through this venture. So, Dr. Noblock, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate you giving that intro on sort of how things got started. As has kind of already been said, I'm Angie Noblack. I'm an internal medicine physician. My pronouns are she and hers. I've had a wonderful experience working with this clinic and really diving into this care that is greatly needed in our communities. I think I kind of break it down into three things when I think about the impact that this has had. Number one always is our patients. And as Matt mentioned, I think as I've gone through this, I've just been amazed at the response by patients, families, friends, tears of joy, of being able to talk about their story in a safe space, and some of these people travel from across the state. I've had some people, from 2 to 3 hours away. And so, these people are patients who have not been getting care regularly, and either due to just fear out of having a negative interaction with healthcare providers or an actual experience with that, which we know happens unfortunately often. And so I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed working with this patient population and kind of getting them into, whether it's mental health, which is a huge component of things, getting them into subspecialty care that they've been lacking for some time, getting them medications that they should have been on for many years. And then just supporting the family with our team of people. So our licensed social worker who helps kind of get people directed in a mental health direction. And One Iowa, unfortunately with COVID, Max had to kind of pull out of the clinic, but had been there providing information about networking and the resources they had. So it was really a multidisciplinary approach. And we hope to get back to that as COVID starts to continue to improve, and hopefully that will continue to happen. So, from a patient perspective, I can't tell you enough about how great this has been. And I find so much value in taking care of these folks. So, and it's just that safe space that allows them to be who they want to be. Matt's put up there on the screen some of the things that we offer. It really is a primary care setting where they can get anything that they need, listed there. I won't repeat that for you, but it really is a very comprehensive place to get all of their healthcare done. We also have some funds available through fundraising and foundation through the UniPoint Health Foundation that allows us to use some of that funds for people who do not have access from an insurance standpoint, or money for medication or transportation, those sorts of things. So the second big area is really kind of our provider and staff growth. How did we prepare those folks to do that? The Safe Zone training, as Matt mentioned, was a huge component of that. That was done by One Iowa, as he mentioned. And that was instrumental in sort of getting the ball rolling, and we continue to engage in that ongoing education all the time. There's been a lot of involvement. We have tons of requests from students and learners, from nursing to physician, physician assistant, nurse practitioner, residents who are in our Unity Point residency programs. Everybody wants to be a part of this, to the point where we've really had to figure out how best do we do that? How do we share this and help people grow in their education and learning at the same time as providing this safe, environment for folks? So we had one of our medical students do a quality initiative project on anxiety and depression screening, because we know that that's a big area, and we found that we really could improve upon how we were doing that. And so we've made some changes there. We stay up to date on guidelines through ongoing continuing medical education, such as through the Gay Lesbian Medical Association. They have an annual conference, and then ongoing collaboration with folks like One Iowa, Iowa Department of Public Health. And then, the third piece of everything is really kind of our community. I think this has impacted our community in a really big way. I hear people talk about this clinic all the time. It comes up, and, engage, parties or things that I'll go to, or events, and people kind of know that I'm involved. They'll ask questions about it. I get to do education on the fly. So lots of really good conversations happening out of this work. Fundraising has been great. People have really responded to the needs. And then just working with our partners in the community as far as referral sources. You know, we talk to them about, hey, has your team been through One Iowa Safe Zone training or any sort of, you know, LGBT community training? Do they feel comfortable with taking care of our patients if we're going to refer them to you? And so that then sparks a conversation on their side saying, well, gee, you know, we haven't really done that. And that's why I think it's great that, you know, all of you are here sort of, you know, thinking about how do we improve that across our community. And so it just kind of everything spurs from there. And so I can't tell you, you know, again, how much I enjoyed working with this project. And my hope is that over time that, you know, every place within Unity Point and other healthcare organizations is a safe space for somebody to go to get all-inclusive care where they feel they can be themselves. I think that would be the ultimate goal for everybody. So that's really kind of my summary. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll kind of, or we can do that at the end and I'll kind of kick it back to Joyce.
Well, I am ready to go if there are no questions. Let me see if I can successfully share my screens. Joyce Mcdaniel. I am the Vice President of Human Resource and Education for Unity Point Health Des Moines. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am going to have to own. Are you guys seeing my slide?
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes.
Now, are you seeing it in?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, perfect. Well, I have to own that I put in a 9, and I'll just say that I put in a 9 because I'm optimistic that we are providing a welcoming environment. We have made a lot of progress, and we would not have made the progress that we've made over the past really solid 5 years if it wasn't for our partnership with One Iowa and other community partners, and also our commitment to be better and to listen to our team members and our patients and our job applicants about how we can be better. So I'm going to own the 9, and hopefully the desire to be a 9 is okay, because that's definitely what we strive to do. So we actually have been committed to this. Our DEI priorities really are in 3 categories. We've tried to refine kind of what we're going to focus on so that we can do 3 things well rather than trying to do everything. So strengthening our community partnerships to provide access to youth, to give them exposure to healthcare careers, and to build diversity within our workforce and within the medical profession and healthcare careers overall. The second is to increase diversity in our workforce, specifically in leadership, so that we model the community that we serve. That is our goal. And then the third priority is to identify and eliminate disparities in the healthcare that we deliver. So those are our priorities. Just very briefly, our structure, we have 3 different DEI steering committees. We have a DEI steering committee that really focuses on education and employee resources. We have a health equity steering committee that focuses specifically on those disparities in the healthcare that we deliver. And then we have our LGBTQ steering committee. We also have a Unity Point Health DEI Council that we participate in, so that is at our system level. We have community partners that include not only One Iowa, but our community health needs assessment is also we partner with lots of community participants in that. The Greater Des Moines Partnership with the Inclusion Council, of course, we appreciate all of the resources made available through the partnership. The Iowa Hospital Association is another partner. So when we defined our LGBTQ steering committee that's been in place for, I would say, about 5 years now, the purpose was to provide ongoing strategic direction for patient, family, and team member initiatives to ensure that we're becoming a better organization and that we are welcoming, and not only welcoming, but competent to provide employment opportunities and to provide health care to members of the community, including those that are members of LGBTQ. So our objectives are there. I won't read through that, but that was really, those are the 3 objectives or 4 objectives that we have for that steering committee. So I would tell you that the components of the success that we have had and the progress that we've made thus far really boils down to a couple of things. Executive leadership involvement, as well as team member engagement, involvement, and support. Our community partnerships, I've already mentioned, we would not be here without those partnerships. But a huge part of our success so far and the progress that we've made has been driven by using the HEI survey and all of the resources made available through the Human Rights Campaign as our roadmap. If you're not familiar with the HEI survey, it is specifically for healthcare organizations to, you can apply, you can submit a survey each year. And we've been doing this for, oh my goodness, over 10 years. I think it's probably 14 or so. And that is our opportunity to kind of do a self-assessment about how we're doing. How are we doing as an employer? And how are we doing as a healthcare provider? So we submit a survey for each one of our hospitals in Des Moines. And I'm very pleased to let you know that all 4 hospitals, all 4 of our Unity Point Health Des Moines hospitals were identified at leader status in the HEI survey for 2021. And we are just beginning to kick off the work to submit our survey for 2022. So the thing that I wanted to make sure you understood is that this is for healthcare organizations, but employers actually, through the Human Rights Campaign, there's an opportunity to submit a survey to be a leader for employers. And that focuses on the same criteria, but just takes out the healthcare provider pieces, if that makes sense. So what we have done is that the survey is broken down into 5 categories: staff training, employee benefits and policies, patient and community involvement, patient services and support, and responsible citizenship. So the information that's available through the Human Rights Campaign is phenomenal. They provide free education for organizations that have submitted a survey and want to continue to educate and grow and become better. The education is free and it is excellent. It is excellent education. We tap into that on a regular basis. And the survey is set up that it has criteria for each segment. And the survey actually tells you what you need to have in place in order to earn credit for that particular criteria. So very, very, very useful, very beneficial. If you're not familiar with that, or if you're interested in that, you can go to the Human Rights Campaign website and obtain more information, or we are certainly willing to visit with you about that journey for us. For our organization, our significant accomplishments, I've tried to identify some of them. And obviously our clinic that we opened was a significant accomplishment. But we have lots of other things that are going on that seemed at the time that we were doing them to be, wow, why didn't we do this before? So one of the things reminds me of what Sam was saying during his presentation, in that, using non-binary language in contracts. It seems simple now, but if you looked at our contracts 5 years ago, it would say he/she. So getting that converted over to they, like I said, seems simple now, but certainly has been a journey. And I'm sure you could find documents where we haven't caught it and gotten it changed. one of the things that we implemented in 2018 that is now being developed even further is a project that's underway to develop a program and resources for transgender patients or team members. And I have to thank Sam because he actually has been a very active participant in the group that has been working on this. And he has provided insight that is valuable to make sure that when we set this up and that we implement this, that it is truly something that can be accessible by our team members, and that it is welcoming and it's easy to use both for our team members and our leaders that will be helping. Those are the accomplishments I wanted to cover. Our education is just continual. The Safe Zone training that kind of started back in 2017 with One Iowa, and then we have done a lot of development within our organization to continue to educate providers and team members and leaders. So that is really what I wanted to share with you. And then I'm going to quickly try to bring up the chat to see if there are questions. I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Joyce, for giving that overview. There is a question now. How do you solicit members as a part of the committees you mentioned?
Yeah, so we actually have such a strong level of interest right now that we are trying to make sure that we harness all of the interest and start some new projects so that we can keep everyone engaged. Because, for example, one of our steering committees now has 60 people on it, which is difficult for a steering committee. So we are constantly really just promoting and welcoming people, team members across the organization to join. We do that in orientation. We do that in our recruitment efforts. And then the committees themselves, the members, they're constantly talking to people about it. So it has been just phenomenal. And I remember talking with principals several years ago about, because we were struggling to kind of get people involved and to come forward and be part of the groups. And I'm like, okay, we're doing something wrong. What is it? And I remember specifically what someone said to me from principal. They said, make sure that you are valuing the input and participation of allies. It doesn't need to just be, if you have a resource group for LGBTQ, make sure that you're welcoming allies too. And then we converted our steering committees to be led by team members, not executives. And that is when we really started seeing a lot of interest, tons of engagement. And so that's really how we kind of turned the corner, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's such a great best practice. I know we have just a few more minutes left, but I just wanted to point out a few things as best practices that Joyce said. I don't know if Joyce intentionally said that or not, but just wanted to point out that the way that they have figured out just to focus on 1 to 3 areas, right? Sometimes people feel crippled about where do we start? How much should I do? I'm not doing enough. And so 1 to 3, starting with 1 to 3 measurable goals is definitely a great idea. And then you can move on and continue to do other things and grow. But don't feel crippled with, I'm not doing enough, or we're not doing enough, and how many should we do? I also kind of caught that, it starts at the top. Leadership, senior, it's very important for senior leadership to be 100% bought into any of the DEI initiatives. And so Joyce is a great example. We know there are other senior leaders within the organization who are very committed to doing this, and Joyce is sitting at the top level as well. And so her time, her commitment is very important. And being intentional and strategic. I think if you notice the 3 goals that they have, I'm sure they took a lot of time navigating through that, sifting through that. What should we do? How much should we do? And so just, it's okay to take time. And it's okay to start today if you haven't started that journey. I always say a good time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, but another good time to plant another tree is right now, right today. And so don't feel afraid of that journey. Don't feel afraid of taking that first step. And so those are just some few, best practices that Joyce had pointed out, and I wanted to reiterate. One of the new best practices that I've read about is rewarding your ERG leaders. LinkedIn is actually doing that. LinkedIn is paying their ERG leaders additional bonuses or extra, because it's a lot of money. It's a lot of not only time, but emotional labor sometimes. People of color, people of marginalized identities have to go through, and we always pick on that one Black person or one Asian person or one person with a disability to keep asking them for help. And so it's a good idea to also figure out a way to reward them, right? And so those are just some best practices that I also wanted to share. But give any last minute thoughts, any questions for anybody who wants to share. We really have a monthly webinar, as many of you know. I see a lot of familiar names and faces and a lot of new ones. Please continue to look out for our future events. We do once a month webinar. We actually have an event next Thursday around tapping immigrant talent. We have a talent shortage in our country, in Iowa, and our Des Moines and our region is not unique. And there are pockets of talent who are work ready, but we're not looking at them, and we don't know how to tap into them. And so please feel free to go to our website, look at the calendar, sign up if you haven't. I'm happy to send it out to you. But also we want to continue to improve our offerings to all of you. We want to hear what you want to hear. We want to offer what is it that you want to hear. And so we'll be sending out a survey, and if you want to it's a very short survey. We're very intentional about keeping it short. And so please take a few minutes to fill that out, and we are right about time. And any last minute thoughts, Joyce or Max or any of our speakers today, Dr. Noblock? I want to thank Quincy and Kelly. I don't know if I mentioned Kelly Breffel's name. She's spent a lot of time from Unity Point in supporting and making this event possible today.
I did put a link to a story in the chat. This was a story, a patient reached out to us unsolicited, and I just wanted to share that. It's gave me goosebumps and made me cry the first time I read his letter.
Awesome.
So.
Thank you. All right, well, we are at 2:30, and I want to respect everybody's time, and thank you so much, all of our speakers, Max, Joyce, Dr. Noblock, and thank you all for hanging out with us, and hope to see you next week, and hope to see you in our future events. Have a great afternoon.